Hey everybody, and welcome to our first review session for Psych 319. Now, we're doing all this review at the very beginning of the semester because I know it's been a while since many of you have taken Research Methods 1 or Stats, so we're going to kind of do a quick refresher on those ideas. Now, with that being said, I think that we probably will cover some new content or maybe some things you didn't really get a chance to talk about all that much in your classes. So even if you feel super comfortable with this material, I think that going through it one more time, especially as you are thinking about how you might want to conduct your own research this semester in our class, maybe thinking about it in that mind frame might be helpful. It might help spark some of those creative ideas that you have for research. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So a quick reminder, if you haven't done so already, to go ahead and take the pre-test for research methods. You can find that on Plato. It's not for a grade at all. It's just really to help me see where you, the class, stands on some of this material. And it'll help me pinpoint what areas I should cover in these review sessions and what info most of us are pretty good on and don't need to talk about. So this review session 1 is going to be broken up into 2 videos. The first video is going to be talking a lot about the scientific method, along with what a theory is and what a hypothesis is, how those two things are different, and how we can apply those concepts to help us understand behavior. The second video that we're going to have is going to be looking at falsifiability and why it's so important to make our predictions before we collect any data whatsoever. So this diagram that you see right here, this is probably familiar to many of you, or at least in concept it is, in its broad picture it is, because this is the scientific method. So we're looking at how the flow of science, where we move from a theory to a hypothesis to data collection, and then depending on what that data says, going back to start all over again. So we're going to come back to this flowchart throughout the semester. So I just want to kind of spend a little bit of time unpacking it here, and we'll talk about more of these things in detail as we move on. But basically, science is a process. Science is self-correcting, which means that given time and energy, that science will provide the correct answers. It doesn't always at the very, very beginning, which we might see in some of our experiments. But that with time, with repetition, we do find the truth. And for us, the truth is about human behavior. Why do people do the things that they do, right? That's why we are in this class. So let's take a quick look at what this offers us. So we see here that we start with theory. So theory is essentially going to be some kind of notion that you have about how the world works, or specifically how human behavior works. Maybe it's you thinking like, you know what I've noticed? I've noticed that people who are introverts and who are shy tend to eat less whenever there are people around them. So that is kind of an idea. That is a theory that you can take that theory that you have about introverts and shy people and how they eat in public, and then you can really target, okay, well, how can we test this? So that's going to lead us to a research question. That research question is going to present to us a research design, so how we decide to tackle answering that research question. And then we form a hypothesis, and we're going to spend a lot of time with hypotheses this semester and talking about them and what makes them work and what makes a good hypothesis. And so we'll develop a hypothesis, then we're going to test that hypothesis. So we'll collect some data. Once we get the data, there are 2 different outcomes then. Maybe we look at our data, so we did an experiment about shy people and whether or not they eat more or less whenever other people are around. And so maybe let's say that they do eat less based on our data. If that is true, then we're going to go back to our theory and we are going to refine it a little bit so that we can be more specific. Maybe we can then refine it to say, okay, we do find that people who are introverts do eat less than people who are not introverts when they are in public. Well, does this include when they are in front of their family? Does this include when they are in front of their friends? Or is it just when they are in front of strangers? Then we can take that idea, move it back down into research design, and then we can test it all over again. So that's if the data support our conclusions. But what about if that's not the case? What if it is inconclusive? Or what if we find that people who are introverts actually eat more? Maybe they're really nervous and so they eat more in public than people who are not. And if that's the case, then we have kind of 2 options. Now, So we either go back to the research design because we have acknowledged that, okay, there might be some confounds, there might be some problems with our research design, so we need to go back and kind of tune it up a little bit, or maybe even just knock it down and start all over. Or we were wrong about our theory. So maybe it's the case that shy people do in fact eat more when they are in public, and so that means that our theory was wrong, it was incorrect, and then we can pose a new theory and then test it all over again. So that's kind of, and that's why I was saying that, with time and with repetition, that the scientific method will give us the correct answer. But it doesn't always, from the very get-go. Sometimes it requires patience in doing things multiple times to find the truth, to find why people do what they do. Okay, so some quick terminology. What is a theory? A theory is essentially kind of a belief about how behavior works. So it's why. So the theory is why we do what we do. Why do people behave the way that they behave? Why do they say the things that they say? That is ultimately what theories are trying to help us explain. And so I do want to point out that theories cannot be 100% correct. That even if, so let's say that you do, moving back here, so let's say that you do find that shy people eat less in public. Does that mean that your theory is 100% correct? No, because again, it could be that maybe they eat less when they are in front of friends, but not eat less when they are in front of family. Maybe it's that they eat less whenever they are in front of strangers, but it doesn't change whenever they are in front of people that they know. And so because of that, because there's always that uncertainty, we can't be 100% sure and confident about our theory. But we can be 100% sure that it is incorrect, that there's something wrong about it. And so this is why you may remember in stats why we talked about having a null hypothesis, and we talk about rejecting or failing to reject the null hypothesis. We'll talk more about that later in these videos. But that's where that comes from. So one example of this is like Freudian dream theory. If you remember Freudian dream theory, the idea is essentially that, we dream what we dream because our subconscious mind, or our unconscious mind, I should say, is trying to communicate with us what we are anxious and stressed out about. Now, the problem with that is that it is an untestable hypothesis. It is an untestable theory. It is a theory that really can't be tested in any scientific way, just by the nature of its own kind of premises. Now, the idea is that it's unconscious mind, and the unconscious mind is something that cannot be tested, and because it cannot be tested, it cannot be proven true or not true. And for that reason, it's not a really good theory, because we can't really apply science to it. But that's part of the reason why Freud is not really practiced all that much in your psychology classes. You don't really see him come up all that much, because a lot of his ideas are not testable. A lot of his ideas are not scientific. And because psychology is a science, we can't really reckon with him in that way. So then what the heck is a hypothesis? I mentioned a hypothesis. The hypothesis is going to be a direct statement that you can test, that you can say is true or is not true. Or maybe I should say that it is not true, or that you can't say that it is not true. So in our class, we always want to frame this as an if-then statement. So you can think of a hypothesis as being something that, as a statement, you can then say, yes, that is correct, or no, that is not correct. So thinking back to our previous example about shy people, our hypothesis might be, if a shy person is around other people, then they will eat less. That is something that you can test. You can directly test that statement. If we stuck with the theory, which is that shy people eat less when other people are around, well, that's a statement that, is kind of vague, and we don't really have a method to test it. We don't really have a way that we can verify that statement. But by turning it into an if-then statement like this, we can then assess the validity of it. Then we can test this idea. We can test this hypothesis. That's why we want this always as an if-then statement. Now, if we want this to, if we want to try this as an example, like if I am tired, then I become stressed, we can turn that into if a person is tired, then they will become stressed. And we can be even more specific, so we can say, now we're turning it into a testable phrase, if a person is deprived of sleep, then they will show more signs of stress. So think of your hypothesis as it should be something that you can test so that you can confirm or disconfirm, and it needs to have something that tells you about what it would take for it to be rejected, or what it would take for it to be proven true or false. So here you're seeing that, all right, if this happens, if this person is deprived of sleep, then this happens. And so then we can find if this happens but this doesn't happen, then we can say this hypothesis was rejected. So you can think of trying to phrase these things in your papers like this. If blank happens, then blank happens because blank. Where because is going to be your theory-based explanation. And we'll go over more examples of that as we go throughout the semester. So here's an example using social justification theory. So social justification theory is the idea, it's a theory in psychology that people will work to preserve whatever kind of status quo they have in their lives, because we all feel a need for stability, or at least a fear of change. So most of us don't like change. Even if, and this is, research has shown this, we don't like change even if we know that change is going to have a positive net outcome on society or on our lives. We are just afraid of change. We don't typically like it. That's true for most people. So if this is true, this theory is true, then we might make an observation. So we make this observation that before women's right to vote was recognized, most women did not believe that women should be allowed to vote. This is an absolutely true statement, that before women's suffrage was granted through the U.S. Constitution, that a lot of women in the U.S. did not feel like women should be allowed to vote. And there's lots of different reasons for why this is. If you're interested in this, just Google it, or just, in your history class, you probably learned more about that here at Westfield. But, okay, so that is our observation. That is going to lead us into this theory that, that we believe that people, will be afraid of change. But we can turn that into something that is testable now. So how can we do that? So let's say if blank, then blank, because social justification theory shows, and then this could be, your explanation. So let's say if I'm going to apply this to me to make it very, very specific and very, very personal, maybe I could say, if I'm presented with two outcomes, one of which will require change, one of which will not require change, then I will go with the option that does not require change, because social justification theory shows that people are afraid of change, essentially. That's a very, very basic kind of hypothesis. Obviously, we would want to be a little bit more broad, or actually a little bit more specific when we're dealing with participants, so we can say exactly what that change is and what that behavior might look like. All right, so if you are interested in how to create effective hypotheses, I put a paper on Plato from 1996. It has lots and lots and lots of ideas for how to generate effective and testable hypotheses. We're not going to go over all of them now, but you can kind of see that there are a couple of different ways you can do that. There's like 20-something ways. I'm grouping them here into kind of categories that McGuire offers here. So this is like a good thing to bookmark and then come back to in a couple of weeks once you start, getting with your group and then talking about how to make a hypothesis or what your hypothesis should be when you're writing it out. So here are a couple of ways you can develop hypotheses. One is finding an odd occurrence in human behavior. So you find the odd occurrence in human behavior, and then maybe you'll want to come up with a theory for why that happens, and then you can develop a hypothesis for what you would expect. Number two here is an introspective self-analysis. So let's say that you are imagining yourself in a situation and then thinking about what you would do in that situation, and then developing a hypothesis based on that. Maybe it's you thinking about what you have been through in the past and then trying to imagine what you would do in similar circumstances. That would also be a way to generate hypotheses. Or having deliberate observation, where you are watching someone intensely or a group of people intensely, and then you come up with a hypothesis for why they do the things that they do based on that observation. So these are all, and then, this paper, which is not required reading for this class, goes into examples of each of these things and gives you a couple of different, scenarios. So it's really, really great to kind of get you thinking creatively and brainstorming on that thing. So here are 5 things that I want you to be thinking about as you are coming up with a hypothesis, or as you are considering other people's hypotheses. So whenever you're looking at other articles, or you're even reading a peer's paper, you can be thinking about, does this hypothesis meet some of these standards? So is it testable? Can this hypothesis be tested? If so, great. If not, then that's a bad sign. Does it have any kind of moral or ethical questions that need to be resolved? This is something that we leave mostly to philosophers and public policy people, where we typically don't try to, as psychologists, as scientists, we do not weigh in on what is ethical or what is moral. That is not our job to do. Is it too specific or is it too general? So that is another thing to be thinking about. Does it have a prediction that matters? So does the outcome of this matter if it is validated or not? If it doesn't matter, then maybe it's not a great hypothesis. And then finally, I want to make this one clear, because this is going to be a running theme this semester, is that does your hypothesis provide value? Is it still important to know about, even if you prove it false? Now, this last piece here, the reason why I'm pointing this one out is because in our research this semester, there's going to be a lot of groups that you have a prediction, and that prediction doesn't happen. And a lot of times people get discouraged when that happens. But here's the thing, if you have the right hypothesis, if you have a good hypothesis, then it doesn't matter if it was proven true or proven false. And I'm using proven true in the way that we normally mean it. We'll go on to talk about why maybe we shouldn't use that phrasing in just a moment. But let's say that your prediction it seems to work, that it does accurately predict what happens. That's great, awesome, you were right. But what happens if it doesn't? If it doesn't, and it seems like your hypothesis was false, in that case, then you learn something very valuable, right? So let's go back to the example of shy people eating. So let's say that a shy person eats a lot whenever they are around other people. That is not what we predicted, right? But the reason why that's so valuable, even if we were wrong initially, is because it does tell us something about human behavior. It does tell us that even introverts, that something about eating food does not change their behavior, and that's important to know. All right, so that's the circle of life, and there you have it. Okay, so let's give ourselves a quick break here. So think to yourself about where you might start here. So let's say that you are interested in abnormal psychology. I know that most of us are, right? Most of us do want to do something in abnormal psychology or counseling or clinical psychology and things like that. And so you can be thinking about what areas you are most interested in. You know, did you learn about, let's say, PTSD and you're really interested in that? Or did you learn about depression and you're really interested in that? Or schizophrenia, so on and so forth. And if so, then you can be thinking about those prior hypothesis generation techniques. Maybe you're thinking about your own experience with that psychological concept. Maybe you are thinking about what you would do if you were in that situation, those types of things. So you could be thinking about those potential hypotheses and things like that. So you're going to develop a theory, then you're going to try to come up with a hypothesis. So it would be okay, in this quick little exercise to think about, what that is. And if we were in class, I would have you, take out a sheet of paper and write this yourself, and then we would kind of pass around some ideas and see, what each of us have, and talk about, could we improve our hypotheses? So, so because we're doing this online, you'll have to kind of imagine how that might work. But I would encourage you to go ahead and stop this video and try that out. Try to think about, okay, I'm interested in depression, and I have noticed that people who are depressed typically like to stay home. Does that mean that people who are depressed are more likely to be introverts? They're more likely to be shy? I don't know. That's a testable question, right? And so that might be, your theory. Then you're going to come up with a hypothesis that is, if someone is shy, then they are more likely to be depressed. That's one hypothesis. Or if someone is depressed, then they are more likely to score high on an introvert personality questionnaire. You get the idea. So go ahead, try to make your own, see how easy or how difficult it might be. So yeah, pause it, and then we're gonna wrap up this video in the next couple of slides. Okay, all right. So one really big kind of idea that I find that a lot of us don't really have a lot of exposure to in Psych 219 is the idea of parsimony or Occam's razor. Now, I feel like most of us have probably heard the phrase Occam's razor because it does come up in television, usually in detective shows, where people will say like, oh, well, according to Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is the correct one. That is not true. It is not true that Occam's razor says that every single detective show, Law and Order SVU, Sherlock, all of these, when they say it, they get it wrong. So I'm going to lay some truth on you and tell you what it actually means. Basically, this phrase is not true. Instead, what Occam's razor is the idea that if you have two explanations, that the one explanation that makes the fewest assumptions is the one that you should use because it makes the fewest assumption. It makes the fewest leaps in logic. It has the fewest unknowns, essentially. So let's give a practical example of this. So, we were talking this long-running example about shy people eating less whenever they are around other people. Okay, so what is the theory there? Why is this happening? So we could say that, okay, the reason for this is because, one, people who are introverts, they are worried about what other people think of them whenever they are eating, and that's the reason why. So that's one explanation. Another explanation, so maybe the explanation is that the reason why this happens is because people who are introverts are typically very worried about how they appear to other people, and because they are very worried about how they appear to other people, they're worried about what the person across from them is thinking about, and because of that, it is ruining their appetite because they have a lot going on in their head. Okay, so in both of those cases, I gave you explanations for why this might happen. One of those was more detailed, right? The second one felt more specific, and because it felt more specific, most of us might feel like, okay, that's the correct one. But because it makes more assumptions, it's assuming what the shy person is thinking, it is also assuming what the other person is thinking, and it's assuming how that is affecting that person's appetite, versus the first explanation, which did not make many assumptions. So because of that, we would actually want to go with the first theory, that basically because, this person is shy and they don't like to do things in front of other people, that's why they're not eating. It didn't say anything about their appetite, right? That is an assumption that we were making. And so we don't want to make that assumption. We basically want to make the fewest number of logical leaps and guesses as possible, which is why we would go with that first explanation there. So here's another example. So let's say that your friend canceled plans for this evening because she said that she had homework. Now there are two explanations that you might come up with here. The first theory is that she did indeed have homework and that prevented her from going out, to hang out with you at the bar or whatever that night. That's one theory. The second theory is that your friend is avoiding you because she doesn't actually like you, and because of that, she lied to you because she doesn't want to go out. So, in both of these two cases, let's say that based on the data that we have, we can't prove either of them true or false. The one that we should go with as our working explanation is theory number one. Why? Because it makes the fewest number of assumptions. The second theory, it is making a couple of assumptions, right? It is assuming that she doesn't like you. It is assuming that she's avoiding you because she doesn't like you, and it's assuming that she is lying to you because she doesn't like you and because she wants to avoid you. That is more theory, that is more assumptions than she had homework, and because she had homework, she wasn't able to go out with you. All right, so let's use one more example, this one also using psychology. You may remember Pavlov's dogs, right? So Pavlov's dogs, those adorable little dogs that whenever they heard the ring of the bell or the audio cue, they would begin to salivate because they knew that food was on the way, right? You remember that? So there are a couple of different explanations for why this happens. So theory number one is that this is a reflexive behavior, that the dog hears the tone and automatically, instinctively, they begin to salivate. So the presence of a stimulus is going to elicit that physiological response of salivation. The second theory is that the dogs expect food, or the second explanation, I should say. The dog expects food, and because the dog knows that food is on the way, they begin salivating, knowing that they are about to eat. So, which of these theories is best? Which of these theories should we use? Now, we don't have data to confirm either of them, but based on these theories, the first one is going to be the one that we want to use. Why? Because it has the fewest number of assumptions, the fewest number of logical leaps. Theory number 2, it presupposes that dogs are expecting food, and because they are expecting food, they are going to begin salivating because they also know that they're about to be eating, and they have also learned that this sound is related to the future event of food coming. That's a lot of assumptions to make, versus theory number 1, which is that it is reflexive, that whenever one of these things happens, it elicits a response in the other. There's many fewer responses there, and that's one of the reasons why we would go with that one. It's a little bit less of an exciting explanation, but because it has the fewer number of assumptions, that's what we are going with. And so that, just to go back here, that's what parsimony is. Parsimony is that we want to keep things using the fewest number of assumptions as possible. So a parsimonious explanation is an explanation that doesn't have very many assumptions to it. All right, that's where I want to stop for now. Thank you for tuning in. The next video will wrap up this session, and I will see you there.